Well, the topic of divorce is a sensitive and a personal topic for myself because my parents are divorced. And as anyone can tell you, it's a very painful experience. And I think my questions about divorce in some way led me to Catholicism because as a young person, I was interested in marriage and what is marriage and what is divorce and how does it fit together in God's plan. And so today we're going to look at the Catholic teaching on divorce, and particularly divorce and remarriage, because a lot of people are confused about it. There's a lot of people who've been wounded and hurt through divorce, and a lot of divorced people think that there is no room for them in the Catholic Church. So we're going to look at the teaching of Christ on that. Well, we're going to look at the Old Testament teaching, then the teaching of Christ, and then try to explain the impediments to marriage and also make sense of annulments and how they're different than divorce and what the different impediments for an annulment are. So we got a lot of great stuff to cover today. We'll begin by just looking at marriage as this institution that was created by God, according to the church, in the Garden of Eden. The first man and the first woman were joined together not by a priest or a minister or deacon. They were joined together directly by God into a union that was lifelong and exclusive. So Adam and Eve. And as the Old Testament moves along, we see that there is sometimes a loosening up of this traditional form of marriage between one man and one woman. And Moses allowed for a bill of divorce. Also, Moses allowed for, in certain cases, polygamy. That is, a man having more than one wife. Now, Christian scholars have debated why this is, Jewish scholars as well. And the reason is, there's a consensus, is that the people of Israel, the Jewish people, after the incident with the golden cow, falling into idolatry, turning away from God after he had delivered them from Pharaoh and through the Red Sea, their hardness of heart, their turning away, which we see repeated over and over in the Old Testament, revealed that they were heading down the wrong path. And so God gave certain dispensations through Moses to allow the people to remain in covenant until he revealed himself fully as a God of love and of mercy through the incarnation of Jesus Christ in the womb of the Virgin Mary and inaugurated the final covenant, the new covenant of Jesus Christ. Also, there was a concern that if there was a strict teaching of holy matrimony, that there would be wife slaughter. The Jewish rabbis talk about this. Even today, they agree that because of the hardness of the heart of the people in the Old Testament, that if they had an exclusive rule of matrimony, they would have killed their wives. They would have committed wife slaughter so that they could marry another. So there's this little bit of slippage in the Old Testament. But Christ comes in the New Testament. He says, I know that Moses allowed you to have a bill of divorce, but that's not really God's intention for you human beings. Instead, he wants it to be as it was in the beginning. Adam and Eve, a man and a woman. So when a man and a woman enter into holy matrimony, especially now in the new covenant, they make vows before God and before a priest or a deacon or a bishop, before sponsors, bridesmaids, groomsmen, and before a community, the parish church and their families. It's a public event, it's a civil event, and it's a religious event. In those vows, they say, "Till death do us part." That's the integral element of the vows said in holy matrimony. And when they intend that, and when they say that, and they say those vows in the form of the church, they are mystically united. Grace flows from God, from the woman, through the woman into the man, and grace flows from from God through the man into the woman. And that grace comes together, and they are united in wedlock, in holy matrimony. And, as the priest says, he quotes Jesus Christ, "What God has joined together, let no man put asunder." What God has joined together, let no man divide. And notice that Christ says, no man. That means not the groom, not the bride can divide it. Not the parents. The priest can't divide it. A bishop can't divide it. Not even the Pope himself can divide this mystical sacrament of marriage. What God has joined together, let no man put asunder. And so the Catholic Church is the only religion that I know of that affirms this teaching that once a man and a woman have been joined together in matrimony, they cannot be divided except by death. You know, the Eastern Orthodox Church has capitulated on this. They allow divorce and remarriage. The Protestants, following in the example of Henry VIII, and also Luther allowed it. And then the other world religions like Islam and Judaism also allow it. So the Catholic Church is unique in this, hardcore teaching, this firm stance that matrimony is until death. Now, there's a passage in the New Testament, and we're going to read it in just a second here, but where Christ seems to give an exception and allows for a divorce. And we're going to look at that right now. It comes from the Gospel of St. Matthew. Quote, "Because of your hardness of heart, Moses allowed you to divorce your wives. But from the beginning it was not so. And I say to you, whoever divorces his wife, except for sexual immorality, and marries another, commits adultery." End quote. So people read that passage and they say, well, wait a second. Jesus just made an exception. He says, you can't divorce your wife for any reason except for sexual immorality. So if Jesus allowed for an exception right there in Matthew's gospel, why is it that the Catholic Church raises the bar and says there are no exceptions? Well, here we need to get into the Greek. And in translation, it's a little bit confusing. But if we look at the Greek version of Matthew, we see here that Christ says, except for the case, and it's translated in different ways, but in this translation, sexual immorality. But the Greek word is porneia. Porneia. It sounds kind of like the word pornography. Now, porneia is not adultery. Christ, it could very easily in Greek say adultery. That would have been a different Greek word. Here it says porneia. Now, what is porneia? Well, remember, Jesus is speaking to Jewish people, scribes, Pharisees, rabbi. His audience here is Jewish. And when he speaks of porneia, they're immediately going to think back to the book of Leviticus, because in the book of Leviticus, Moses lists a whole bunch of sexual crimes or sexual perversities. And most of them have to do with incest. And this is sexual uncleanliness or sexual immorality. So it would be, a father having relations with his daughter, or a mother with a son, or with a husband with his sister-in-law. Almost all of them have to do with some level of kinship or incest. These are forbidden. They're seen as sexually impure or sexually unclean. So what Christ is saying here, he's not saying in the exception of adultery, because he could have said that. He could have used the word adultery. Instead, we find porneia. So it's this Jewish idea of a sexually unclean union, usually incestuous. What does this mean? Well, Christ is setting up for his church the idea of an impediment to holy matrimony. He's saying, hey, you can't leave your wife, you can't divorce, except if you're in one of these unions, which is sexually impure, according to Leviticus. So if a father is married to his daughter-in-law, no good. Okay, you can divorce, you can separate, because in actuality, there's not even a marriage there. This is where the Catholic Church gets the idea of an annulment. That union in God's eyes is null. Or if a young man marries his stepmother, or his mother-in-law, or his sister, or his aunt, in God's eyes, that union is unclean, it's impure, it's incestuous, it's not a true marriage. And in that case, those two people should in fact seek a formal separation. So that's what we see in Matthew's gospel. And it can be confusing in translation, but I think once you see the Jewish context and you see the meaning of the original Greek term, you realize that Christ isn't talking about one single exception for divorce. He's talking about the impediments that were already in place for Jewish people in the book of Leviticus. Okay, so that brings us to the question, well, what are the impediments? One of the great things about being Catholic, I just love, I'm a convert to the church. But one of the things I love about being Catholic is all the clarity. We have not only the Bible, we have not only magisterial documents, teachings, and councils. We not only have a catechism, but we have what's called canon law, the code of canon law. and it regulates all the pastoral principles in the church and the administration of the sacraments. And in canon law, there's a list of impediments that would impede a marriage between a man and a woman. So let's take a look at each one of these impediments. Here we go.